fascist and a communist signing a peace pact. It sounded impossible, almost absurd. But in the summer of 1939, that's exactly what happened. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, two men who despised everything about each other, shook hands through their ministers and sealed one of the strangest deals in modern history, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. To the rest of the world, it looked like a diplomatic stunt. But hidden inside that document were secret maps dividing Eastern Europe like pieces on a chessboard. Poland, the Baltic states, even parts of Finland, all quietly marked for conquest. On paper, it was a promise of peace. In reality, it was a countdown to global war. Hitler never wanted peace. What he wanted was time. He knew Germany wasn't ready to fight on two fronts. Not yet. Since the 1920s, he had written about his hatred for communism and his dream of conquering the living space of the East. But to do that, he first needed to make sure the Soviets would stand aside while he destroyed Poland and crushed Western Europe. A week after signing the pact, the plan began. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, German tanks crossed into Poland. The sky filled with the roar of dive bombers. Cities burned. Within days, the world that had been holding its breath finally exploded. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. For a moment, it seemed as if Hitler's gamble had paid off. The Soviet Union stayed silent, watching from the east. Germany invaded without fear of a second front. His armies swept through Poland, Denmark, Norway, and finally France in just 6 weeks. The world watched in disbelief as Paris fell and swastikas fluttered over the Eiffel Tower. It looked like the dawn of a new empire. But history has a cruel sense of timing. The pact that gave Hitler his confidence would also seal his fate, because the friendship between Berlin and Moscow was never meant to last. Both dictators saw it as temporary, a trick to gain time, and when that fragile deal finally shattered, it would drag the entire world into the deadliest conflict in human history. Hitler believed he was unstoppable. The generals obeyed, the crowds cheered, and the map of Europe turned black under the banners of the Reich. Yet beneath the victories, the seeds of disaster were already growing. His empire stood on arrogance, deception, and a lie he had told himself, that he could outsmart everyone, even fate itself. The storm was only beginning, and the man who dreamed of conquering the world was about to meet the one force he could never defeat: his own pride. At dawn on June 22nd, 1941, the eastern sky lit up with fire. More than 3.5 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. They called it Operation Barbarossa. Hitler believed it would take only a few months. After all, France had fallen in 6 weeks. Why would Russia be any different? The Blitzkrieg roared forward like a machine built from thunder. Tanks rolled across endless fields. Dive bombers screamed above, and cities like Minsk and Kiev vanished under waves of steel and flame. In the first weeks, it looked like another miracle of German speed. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were captured. Entire armies disappeared in encirclements so vast they barely fit on a map. But the victory was an illusion. Every mile gained stretched German supply lines thinner. Trucks broke down, fuel ran low, and food vanished before it reached the front. The Wehrmacht had planned for a sprint. Instead, they were running a marathon across a continent. Behind them, Soviet villagers set their homes on fire, burned their crops, and poisoned their wells, leaving nothing for the invaders but smoke and hunger. Stalin's brutal, scorched earth policy was working. By late summer, Hitler made a fateful mistake. Instead of striking straight for Moscow, he split his forces. Some toward Leningrad, others south to the oil fields of the Caucasus. His generals protested, but he ignored them. He trusted his will more than their experience. It was a decision that shattered the momentum of the Blitzkrieg and gave the Red Army time to recover. Then came the rain. Endless, sticky mud swallowed trucks and tanks alike. Roads turned to rivers of clay. Soldiers pushed their own vehicles through the muck, boots torn, faces hollow from exhaustion. And behind the rain waited something worse, the Russian winter. The temperature plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Rifles froze, engines died, and men collapsed in the snow beside their silent machines. By December, the German army stood at the gates of Moscow, frozen, starving, and out of time. The Soviets, reinforced by fresh troops from Siberia, counterattacked with a ferocity the Germans had never seen. For the first time, Hitler's army was forced to retreat. In his headquarters, Hitler refused to believe what was happening. He shouted orders that ignored reality. No step back. He blamed his generals, his soldiers, anyone but himself. The myth of invincibility, the engine of his empire, began to crack. Operation Barbarossa had been designed to crush the Soviet Union in 3 months. Instead, it opened a second front that would bleed Germany dry for the rest of the war. The Blitzkrieg was dead. In its place stood a nightmare of ice, mud, and endless loss. The storm had turned, and for Hitler, there would be no way back. While German tanks sank into the Russian snow, a very different battle was taking shape far from the front lines. It wasn't fought with guns or bombs. It was fought with machines, sweat, and sheer determination. It was the war of production. As Hitler's armies pushed east, entire Soviet cities packed up and moved. Thousands of trains thundered toward the Ural Mountains, loaded with factory parts, machines, workers, and families. Assembly lines were dismantled piece by piece and rebuilt in freezing fields hundreds of miles away. Women welded tank armor. Children carried bolts and fuel cans through the snow. Engineers slept beside engines to keep them from freezing. The goal was simple: keep the Soviet war machine alive. By the winter of 1941, those new factories began roaring back to life. From the ashes of retreat rose a new industrial heart, one that could produce tanks, planes, and shells faster than Germany could destroy them. The T-34 tank rolled out by the thousands, tough enough to face anything on the battlefield. Soviet Yak fighters filled the skies. Stalin understood what Hitler never did. Wars are not won only by soldiers, but by steel. At the same time, help was crossing the oceans. The United States, still months away from entering the war, had already begun a massive effort known as the Lend-Lease program. Cargo ships sailed through icy Arctic waters, dodging German submarines, to deliver trucks, fuel, food, and raw materials to the Soviet Union. By the end of the war, America would send over 400,000 trucks, 14,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of supplies, an industrial lifeline that turned the tide. While the Soviet Union built behind its mountains, Britain fought to keep the sea routes open. Convoys crossed the Atlantic, hunted by U-boats, but shielded by destroyers and planes. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just about ships. It was about survival. If those convoys stopped, the Allies would starve. They didn't stop. Meanwhile, in Germany, the once unstoppable Reich was beginning to suffocate under its own ambitions. Bombers from Britain and America struck deep into its industrial heart, reducing factories to rubble faster than they could rebuild. Railways broke down, oil supplies vanished, and the same soldiers who once rolled through Paris now fought with half-empty fuel tanks and frozen rations. Hitler still demanded more weapons, more victories, more miracles. But the truth was clear. The miracle was happening elsewhere. Across the Atlantic, American factories were working 24 hours a day, turning Detroit into an arsenal. In the Soviet Union, the trains never stopped. Every day, the Allies were getting stronger, and Germany was running out of everything. The war that began with lightning attacks had turned into a battle of endurance. And in that kind of war, the side with the most steel, fuel, and food would win. Hitler just didn't know it yet. The next great battle would prove it. A city by the Volga that would become the graveyard of his empire. On the banks of the Volga River stood a city of smoke, steel, and pride. Its name alone was a challenge. Stalingrad, Stalin's city. For Hitler, capturing it wasn't just a military goal. It was personal. To take Stalingrad meant humiliating his greatest rival and proving that Germany still ruled the war. In the summer of 1942, he launched Operation Blue, a massive offensive aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city that bore his enemy's name. German bombers turned Stalingrad into a skeleton of ruins. Buildings collapsed into dust. Streets became rubble-filled trenches. Yet instead of surrendering, the Soviets used those ruins as weapons. Every factory became a fortress, every basement a bunker. The fight moved yard by yard, floor by floor. The defenders had one order: not a step back. The Germans advanced, but every block they gained cost them hundreds of lives. The Luftwaffe could no longer bomb freely. The front was too close, the enemy too entangled. As winter approached, Hitler's Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, found itself trapped in a frozen maze of destruction. Ammunition was running out, temperatures plunged below freezing, and men starved among the ruins. Hitler ordered them to hold at any cost. Surrender was forbidden. But then, in November, the Soviets struck back with Operation Uranus. Their counterattack encircled 300,000 German soldiers. The hunters had become the hunted. The Luftwaffe tried to resupply the trapped army by air, but it was hopeless. Planes crashed or were shot down. Food and fuel never arrived. Inside the pocket, discipline collapsed. Soldiers ate horses, leather, even sawdust bread. When Paulus finally surrendered in February 1943, the invincible Wehrmacht had been destroyed. Only 90,000 men survived to march into captivity. Most would never return. Stalingrad was more than a defeat. It was the moment the world realized Germany could lose. But Hitler still refused to accept it. Desperate for redemption, he ordered one last grand offensive, Operation Citadel, targeting a bulge in the Soviet line. For a week, the fields of Kursk became hell itself. In Prokhorovka, over 1,000 tanks clashed at point-blank range. Smoke blackened the horizon. The ground trembled under the weight of steel and fire. When it was over, Germany had lost its last chance to regain the initiative. The mighty panzer divisions were broken, and the Wehrmacht would never again go on the offensive. Stalingrad shattered Hitler's illusion of invincibility. Kursk buried it. From that point forward, Germany could only retreat, step by step, mile by mile, back to the heart of the Reich. By the spring of 1945, Berlin was a skeleton city. Smoke drifted through shattered streets, and the thunder of Soviet artillery never stopped. The empire that once promised 1,000 years had barely survived 12. The Third Reich was dying, not with a final triumph, but with a slow, chaotic collapse. The Red Army closed in from the east, while American and British forces advanced from the west. Hitler's generals begged him to evacuate the capital, but he refused. In his underground bunker, pale and trembling, he still believed victory was possible, that some miracle weapon or sudden betrayal would save him. He moved imaginary divisions on maps, commanding armies that no longer existed. Outside, boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Home Guard were fighting tanks with rifles. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet shells were already falling on the city. The streets of Berlin became a maze of fire and desperation. Civilians hid in basements, whispering prayers or listening to the earth shake above them. Food was gone, water was scarce, and the smell of burning hung everywhere. Still, Nazi propaganda insisted that salvation was near. But reality had caught up. On April 25th, Soviet and American troops met at the Elbe River, splitting Germany in two. The circle around Berlin was complete. Inside his bunker, Hitler raged at the betrayal of his generals, convinced that the world had turned against him. He appointed new ministers, issued new decrees. None of it mattered. The Reich was already finished. On April 30th, with Soviet troops just blocks away, Hitler made his final decision. In a dim room deep beneath the chancellery, he took a pistol, sat beside his companion Eva Braun, and ended his life. Their bodies were burned in the garden above, just as he had ordered. Hours later, Joseph Goebbels poisoned his own children and followed his Führer into death. Within days, the remaining German forces surrendered. The war in Europe was over. When Allied soldiers entered the concentration camps, they found what the world could barely imagine: mountains of bodies, survivors who looked like shadows, and the full horror of the Holocaust exposed to the light. The dream of empire had become a crime against humanity. Hitler had promised greatness, but left behind only ruin. On May 8th, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. Across the world, people cheered, cried, and mourned. The guns finally fell silent, but the scars remained. Hitler had lost not just a war, he had lost his war against truth, against humanity itself. His empire of hate had devoured its creator. And yet, even among the ruins, one truth stood clear: no power built on fear and cruelty can endure. History always catches up. It always remembers. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy uncovering the real stories behind the rise and fall of empires, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments what moment from history you want to explore next.